important topic, which is Russia's information warfare against Georgia. From as far as back as human history is recorded, information has been a key weapon in war, and thus it is entirely appropriate to speak of information war as conterminous with the human experience. While the volume and penetration of information into the handheld devices that are carried every day bring new relevance and impact, this practice itself dates back to ancient Chinese military strategist Sun Tzu in his writings that all warfare is based on deception in 450 BC. The Kremlin has a long history of executing well-coordinated information influences and operations against its perceived adversaries in order to subvert and undermine them indirectly. And actually, Russia, even today, uses Soviet-era methods to do so. And for example, we can examine Russian reflexive control, which is a theory which Russia used in 1960s. And this was very important one because Russia, with this Russian reflexive control, tried to influence and manipulate decision makers, their beliefs, perceptions, and actions by providing them with false information and misleading narrative, creating desired outcome without their awareness. Interestingly, Russia defines the term definition of Russia of information warfare is different from that of United States, because United States definition indicates that information warfare is conducted during military operations, while Russia says that it is done both during war and peacetime. Let me highlight features common to Kremlin propaganda regardless of the target country. So Kremlin propaganda is created in various formats, right? Text, audio, prints, etc. And it is spread through different channels as well, like internet, social media, direct meetings, TV, and so on. What is important is that Kremlin ignores objective reality. The Kremlin propaganda is mainly based on fabricated news and distortion of real facts and Kremlin interpretation, which means that it takes stories or news out of the context and covers this from the angle which is preferred by the Kremlin itself. Actually, what is really interesting is that Kremlin does not intend to present lies as truth, but to confuse a person by distorting the facts so that they cannot see the real picture by receiving contradictory information. Some scholars call it epistemic anarchy. This epistemic anarchy occurs when a society becomes unable to agree on basic truth, leading to disorientation and a lack of belief in anything worth fighting for. Of course, what is important is that Kremlin propaganda is created very quickly and continuously, which means that it respreads and replicates information, like all disinformation messages, let's say. These are because in order to achieve its objectives and to not to decrease the meaning of this disinformation. Of course, Kremlin adds characteristics based on the country's context. I will start exploring and analyzing Russia's information warfare against Georgia from 2008 war, because this event was very important as Russia used its information warfare in support of military aggression against Georgia. So here we have like both countries engaged in intense information war before, during, and after the conflict. But what is important here is that Russia had messages consisted of two elements. The one was for export and one was for domestic usage. In the message for an abroad audience, Russia tried to Russia claimed that its actions were in line with the international law, and that the actions taken by Russia were in keeping with those of the West taken in the past, making references to the case of Kosovo and NATO in Yugoslavia in 1991. Russia politicians and media representatives actively used Western terminology such as like genocide and ethnic cleansing, these legal terms. For domestic usage, Russia spread messages that Georgia was the aggressor, that it had left no choice but to intervene to defend its citizens and to human rights. And what is important here is that media actually spread photos and videos placing special emphasis on humanitarian issues. For example, they spread photos of human suffering, which indicated Georgia's heartlessness. Georgia, on the other hand, claimed that Russia violated international law by invading a sovereign country, and that Tbilisi's introduction of troops into the region was legitimate and could not be casus belli. Assuming that Russia planned this war well in advance, that it was not reactive action at all, we can also argue that this information warfare was meticulously planned in advance. And actually, Radio Free Europe also indicated that media coverage was exceptionally prepared since the outbreak of the war. Russia had enormous advantages here. Its channels, financially, also, of course, it had influences on the reporters compared to Georgia, which had a vastly smaller media. While these information were brought very modest success to Russia in the international arena, domestically, it's actually the public were very receptive to the messages that were spread by the authorities, because as VCIOM opinion poll indicates, 51% of Russians admitted that their attitude toward Georgia had worsened, and 75% of respondents supported the Russian government decision to send their troops to South Ossetia. After the war, of course, Kremlin continued its information war against Georgia, especially as Georgia's integration to EU intensified. I would like to clarify some objectives what Russia wants to achieve through this information warfare. The first is Russia tries to discredit Georgia's integration into European Union and NATO, spreading false information about NATO and portraying Georgia's rapprochement with NATO as a threat to Georgia's territorial integrity. Another thing is that it tries to downgrade Western values. It says that it is very incomparable with Georgian culture and history. Also in this regard, the homophobic nature of Russian propaganda is particularly visible. At the same time, like the common history and cultural characteristics such as Georgian Orthodox Christianity are brought forward and presented as counterweight of Western values. Also, it is very important that Russia tries to incite negative attitude toward Georgia's strategic partners, especially the US. It says that US is a source of global destabilization. Even now, since Russia's brutal war against Ukraine in 2022, it intensified its propaganda and said that US tries to open a new front in Georgia and to involve Georgia in this war. Also, this is another important strategy that Russia tries to spread conspiracy theories. One of the conspiracy theories that I would like to mention was about Lugar Lab, which Russia actually claimed that Russia accused Georgia of outbreak of pandemic diseases of humans and animals. And over the course of COVID-19, the Kremlin has continued this assault on the Lugar lab, and also it blames US, says that US tries to use Lugar lab for the development of biological weapon. Of course, Russia uses several domains to achieve, to make its information warfare more successful. The first one is media, of course, such as Sputnik Georgia, of course, Russian proxies such as Altinfo. Also, what I found alarming is that NDI polls indicate that majority of Georgians are watching, getting their news and political news from television, and that 23% of them are using foreign channels, especially Russian channels. So it can be assumed that approximately 1/5 of Georgian TV viewers are susceptible to Kremlin propaganda. Kremlin uses its propaganda through spreads its propaganda through political parties and political figures. And we can divide this into two. The first one is our political parties that are openly pro-Russian, and the second one are political parties who are not openly and officially pro-Russian, but they are pro-Georgian, pro-neutral, but the messages are the same here because both of them are trying to, are skeptical to the Georgia's integration to the European Union. Also, the Georgian church is a very important player here. Mainly, they spread the myth of incomparability of Georgian traditions with Western cultures, and many clerics in their sermons develop a myth about civilization, unity with Russia, and moral incomparability with the West. Now, I would have several recommendations to build resistance and counter this disinformation. Firstly, I think that Kremlin information war should be officially admitted and defined as a threat to Georgia's security. And it should be, of course, written in the relevant documents. Also, the government should develop a very clear strategy how to tackle this information. I also think that the State Security Service should declare the fight against propaganda as one of the priority areas of its activity. And Georgia could create, for example, the EU has East Stratcom, which is a state structural unit. And I believe that Georgia should create this kind of state structural unit, which would conduct research and analysis, and based on that, develop strategy continuously. Finally, I will conclude my presentation with, again, ancient Chinese military strategist Sun Tzu saying that 100 wins out of 100 battles is not the best. Forcing another army to surrender without a battle is the best. So it is important that we believe that we are aware of it, resist it, and understand what Russia tries to achieve with this information war, and have counter strategy for it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Irina. That was definitely a pressing issue that we still face today. And actually the next panelist, our next panelist, Justin Tomczyk from Stanford University. He will talk about issue that is also related to Russia's warfare. He will talk about shifts in personnel deployment throughout the southern military district since February 2022. Please, Justin, you can start.
Hi, hello. I'm going to turn off my camera and share my screen. So when that comes on, please let me know if you see the title to my presentation. Oh. Okay.
Yes,
you can see this? All right. And this is still visible, right? Okay, well, thank you. Good afternoon, and to any other Americans in the audience, good morning. My name is Justin Tomczyk. I'm a graduate of Stanford University's MA program in Russian and Eastern European Studies, and my research is focused on Russian foreign policy in the South Caucasus. Like many of you, for the past year and a half, I've been closely following developments related to Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine and its impact on the surrounding region. This project was partially inspired by comparisons that journalists, academics, and friends of mine in the region have made towards their own experiences and events in recent years. Today, I'll be exploring how Russia's invasion of Ukraine has impacted personnel deployment in the South Caucasus, or more specifically, how the invasion has led to the deployment of forces from territories like Abkhazia and South Ossetia towards Ukraine. And before I really dive into this, this is a little bit media heavy. So on the off chance that this does run over, please feel free to flag and I will skip to the part where I need to skip. Now, the force gathered by the Russian Federation leading up to the invasion of Ukraine is believed to have been as large as 190,000 soldiers. At the time, observers believed that this force was representative of a supposedly modernized Russian military, a military which would have abandoned Cold War visions of mass maneuvers of infantry and armor, and instead act as a professional army capable of combined arms operations. After years of showcasing new hardware and weapons concepts, this military would be presented an existential threat to Ukraine and a formidable challenge to NATO. Yet, as we all know, the invasion force revealed itself to be a Potemkin village of its own, stumbling into a slow, grinding war of attrition against a country which has spent much of the past 9 years preparing accordingly. First-hand accounts of the opening days and weeks of the 2022 invasion describe disoriented conscripts sent into battle following training exercises in Belarus. Analysts have suggested that the Russian military has used Soviet-era maps to navigate the roadways, cities, and topography of modern Ukraine. Now, it may be hard to see on the screen, but this timetable captured by Ukrainian intelligence and circulated in late 2022 shows yet another deficiency in Russia's initial invasion plans. I've highlighted the first square in red. Listed on the order of battle for the invasion are elements of Sobor and Omon police tactical units. It was believed that these units sourced from local police forces would join the 104th Guards Air Assault Division and advance into southern Belarus and drive a wedge between eastern and western Ukraine. It's believed that these police units face some of the highest attrition rates among elements of the, quote, special military operation during the early stages of the war. Rather than debating the strategic intent of including these police units, we should recognize the broader implication. Even from the beginning of its campaign in Ukraine, the Russian military has faced a deficit of manpower and has had to draw upon auxiliary and secondary sources of military strength. As the war has shifted into grinding urban combat with high rates of attrition, the loss of manpower among special forces units like the VDV and frequent reconstitutions by professional forces like Wagner Group suggest that this problem will remain for the foreseeable future. Now, my research question is focused on the following. How has the war in Ukraine impacted Russian military deployments in Abkhazia, Armenia, and South Ossetia? Or more specifically, have any forces been pulled from these areas and deployed to Ukraine? And if so, what amount? Now, there are certain limits on this study. First and foremost, as with any conflict, this is a contested information space. This includes misinformation, the unintentional sharing of false or inaccurate information, as well as disinformation, the intentional spread of false, misleading, or inaccurate information. While I approach this topic reading things at a face value, the reality is that the full scope and scale of the answer to my research question will only come with time. Additionally, elements of this study are dependent on human intelligence and sources of information that cannot immediately be corroborated. Again, while I'm approaching this topic and engaging with this information at face value, it's entirely possible that the assertions made on this topic are an intentional effort to mislead an audience, including myself. And finally, there's the difference between a likelihood and a certainty. Again, the history of this war is still being written, and in many cases, it is too difficult to immediately parse what is undoubtedly true versus what is possibly true. This project tries to triangulate the likelihood of information from as many sources as possible. A unit measurement that will come up a lot in this presentation is the Battalion Tactical Group. This is a modular unit that ranges in size, and it's often between 600 and 800 personnel, with 200 being dedicated infantrymen. These formations are flexible in their composition, but have somewhat fallen out of use due to manpower requirements and a newfound reliance on artillery, as noted by the United Kingdom Ministry of Defense. So to give a broad overview of the 3 deployments of the Russian military in the South Caucasus, I've made this chart. All 3 deployments are constituents of 3 larger army groupings in the Russian Federation, and all 3 of those armies are active in Ukraine. meaning the 49th Combined Arms Army, the 58th Combined Arms Army, the 8th Guards Combined Arms Army, are all currently active in operations in the eastern territories of Ukraine. The bases in Abkhazia and South Ossetia are believed to hold about 4,500 soldiers each. The base in Gyumri, Armenia, is believed to hold between 3,000 and 5,000. This does not mean that there are 4,500 combat-ready troops, but rather that the personnel on that base has a total headcount of 4,500. Additionally, the peacekeeping mission to Nagorno-Karabakh shares a unit designation, Voyenna Chaste, with the 102nd Military Base and de facto operates as its extension. However, it should be noted that the troops used in this deployment to Nagorno-Karabakh are in fact part of the Central Military District, and more specifically, the 15th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade. So, looking first at Abkhazia and changes to the unit composition of Abkhazia during the special military operation. So Abkhazia has openly participated in the special military operation since March 25th, 2022. The Ministry of Defense released a statement explicitly stating as such, quote, "The Republic of Abkhazia and the Ministry of Defense in particular fully support the Russian Federation's special military operation in Ukraine." This was followed by a statement on March 29th from the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, which identified 2 battalion tactical groups from the territory of Abkhazia operating within Ukraine. At the time, this was believed to have around 500 troops total. By the summer of 2022, Abkhazian forces had appeared throughout Donetsk and Kherson oblasts, either operating in direct conjunction with Russian regular forces or as semi-autonomous, quote, volunteer units within Russian command. This image that you see is a still that is pulled from a telegram showing a Abkhazian volunteer unit in eastern Ukraine. On the side of his BMP, it says Umenia bez viz. This is a humorous remark after the Ukrainian government forced residents of Abkhazia to obtain visas in order to enter Ukraine. Now, the culmination of this was the capture of Major Pavel Gruzov in Kherson Oblast, Pavel Gruzov being a major member of the Abkhazian Armed Forces and a major, at the time, one of the highest-ranking Russian officers being captured alive in the war in Ukraine. His interview with the Ukrainian military included a admission that the, quote, volunteer units and other Abkhazian forces have been, quote, required to participate in the special military operation, and in fact had done so under duress. Now, it's noted that the last major reference to Abkhazian participation in this invasion came on August 14, 2022. During Ukraine's counteroffensive in Kherson, as well as Kharkiv, Abkhazian units were described by analyst Alexander Kovalenko as being routed at Kryvyi Rih. They had been deployed there as part of the 34th Motor Rifle Brigade. Generally speaking, as he says, quote, generally speaking, the tactical grouping in 7th Army Base have been deployed to Kryvyi Rih, altogether 2 battalion tactical groups of 34th Motor Rifle Brigade. Going on, we can look at South Ossetia and changes in the composition there and deployments to Ukraine. Now, as early as March 15th, there had been evidence of a South Ossetian mobilization for the purpose of deployment in Ukraine. More specifically, on March 15th, a tank was spotted in an unknown area near the 4th Guards military base. On March 16th, a column of vehicles was spotted traveling through the Roki Tunnel to northern Ossetia. Now, Anatoly Bibliova, the president of South Ossetia, had confirmed this deployment on a March 25th post on Instagram, giving his praise for the expeditionary forces. The post on his Instagram shows a column of vehicles waving South Ossetian flags directly traveling to the conflict zone. Now, on March 29th, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine had estimated that there were 3 battalion tactical groups totaling 1,200 Russian and South Ossetian soldiers, which had been deployed to Ukraine. At this point, this had been the largest deployment of any Russian contingent from the South Caucasus. However, as early as March 30th, footage had emerged of South Ossetian soldiers meandering by the side of the road somewhere in the Caucasus. Initial reports began to circulate of widespread defection and refusal to fight among South Ossetian troops that had been moved to Ukraine and had actively been fighting in the conflict zone. This was followed by a statement from former South Ossetian President Eduard Kokoite, who commented that the desertions were likely due to a very specific reason and were not, in fact, without purpose. However, it is possible this could be an instance of political maneuvering given his current role as president of South Ossetia and his expressed interest in future political office. A report from Mediazona details a conversation between President Bibliova and members of the military that had deserted. In addition to complaining about poor quality weapons and a lack of command structure from the Russian military, the discussion with the Ossetian troops include 2 very specific details. First is that the bulk of the individuals who deserted were in fact contract soldiers that had willingly joined the military and were not in fact conscripted into service. The second is that the total number of desertions is estimated to be around 300, nearly a fourth of the territory's contribution to the special military operation. At the moment, while an independent South Ossetian, quote, volunteer brigade continues to operate in eastern Ukraine, this interview and the end of March would essentially mark the main element of major operations by the South Ossetian government in the conflict zone in eastern Ukraine. And finally, there's the case of Armenia. On March 13th, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine alleged that the 102nd Military Base was being used to transit Russian soldiers into Ukraine. This included allegation that elements of the peacekeeping force from Nagorno-Karabakh had also been deployed. This was followed by a second allegation on March 19th that, again, the 102nd Base had been used as a transit point for Russian soldiers traveling into Ukraine. The only evidence I could find of material and/or people being moved from the deployment zone in Nagorno-Karabakh, the second military base, comes in the form of two videos sourced from Telegram. One from Bezmosok, showing automobiles and trucks traveling along an unidentified road, and the second from Caliber_AZ, showing utility vehicles, trucks, and more military vehicles traveling along what is identified as the Lachin corridor. It's worth noting, however, that both governments of Armenia and Russia have denied this allegation, and unlike South Ossetia and Abkhazia, Armenia maintains a fully independent military and is fully independent in its decision-making. However, I was really curious. I felt that if there was smoke, there should be fire, and I should do some digging and see if there was anything. And this led me to a VK page for the 102nd military base in Gyumri. More specifically, the focus of my attention was the section Vopros Otvet, where it is local members of the base, their friends, and their family asking questions to each other about what's happening in the base and its whereabouts. And the first things that I see as early as March 2022 is a sense of just general anxiety and unease. People are asking, guys, please tell me, is everything good at the base? Are things normal? Can someone please give me the contact info for the checkpoint? My son has contacted me. Is there anyone that can tell me about serving at 102nd Army Base? I signed a contract, but I don't know anything about it. It's worth noting that some of these anxieties, the lack of contact with the child, ambiguity as to contract service, are standard operation for the Russian military. These shouldn't be assumed to be anything nefarious or anything bad, but rather just normal operating procedure in this specific military unit. Additionally, there is one individual who, in July, asks the pointed question, can you tell me if your military base will be involved in a special military operation? The user, Valia, responds simply, no, it won't. They're sending soldiers through Novotcherkassk if they're being deployed to the special military operations zone. It's worth noting that that city is the umbrella city in which the army that the 102nd military base is officially constituent of is connected to. Additionally, we have people asking questions on what is it like currently serving on the base. The frequent reference to conscripts serving on the base is not necessarily something new. There have been instances in the past of Russian conscripts serving the base, but it's worth noting that officially conscripts cannot be deployed abroad, and there are passing references to contract soldiers being used almost extensively throughout it. Additionally, there's, again, further ambiguity on location of deployment. Someone describes that they had signed an agreement to serve as a conscript in Armenia. Their question was on the ambiguity as to what was their chance of actually serving in Armenia or a different location. I found this to be very much par for the course, nothing beyond what I had expected going into this project with what I had known. But I did some even more digging beyond that, and I found this very peculiar post. So Pravovyed, is a website where users may ask legal questions and expect to receive advice from a practicing lawyer or anyone with like legal expertise. In this case, an individual asks in Russian, I'm a serviceman at the 102nd military base, and I was wounded by shrapnel during the special military operation. The presidential payments for injured soldiers during the SVO has not been paid. I've already sent my paperwork in February. This user identifies themselves as Dennis in Yerevan. This was posted on April 7th. The image which he has uploaded is a copy of his medical registration showing his injury. I have blocked out the parts that are personally identifying information, but nonetheless, this seems to be a legitimate document detailing this person's injuries. What I found really curious, though, is this number up here. The Voyna Chast is 33742, which is not the code used for either Nagorno-Karabakh nor the base in Gyumri. This is in fact the 77th Anti-Air Missile Brigade, currently located in Koronovsk in Krasnodar Krai. And out of curiosity, I did some more reading, and this unit had actually been promoted and elevated to guard status following its operations in the Special Military Operation. More specifically, this unit functioned as a S-300 battalion engaged in anti-aircraft operations. So, in conclusion, for the near future, the timeline for how long it will take to reconstitute Abkhazian South Ossetian forces is unclear. Even if these forces were to reconstitute themselves to pre-invasion levels, it's very unlikely they would be deployed to the current conflict zone in eastern Ukraine without major changes in Russian doctrine. Additionally, it's very unlikely that there's any large-scale movement of troops occurring within the Russian deployments around Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh. However, it is possible that individual contract soldiers or specialists have been deployed as part of other units in the Southern Military District. However, this would be on an individual basis and would be very hard to corroborate. And yeah, that is just about everything. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justin. We will now actually move to the issues of warfare, to more peace processes. Hopefully, we next have Mehraj Aliyev. Sorry for if I mispronounce names. Mehraj is from Russian East European and Eurasian Center at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and he will talk about the European Union's role in the Armenia-Azerbaijan peace talks. Please, Mehraj. One of our next presenters are also here, Melik and Seda. I will ask you to also log in on Zoom if you are. Okay, so we will save time. Thank you. From CRRC Armenia, and I will talk about benefits of an intersectional approach in context of Armenia's democratic landscape. Can we pass the microphone to Tigran? There. Tigran, if you could switch off the microphones on your laptop and just talk on the microphone on Zoom and laptop as well. Microphone, please.
Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Tigran Melikian. I'm a research fellow at CRRC Armenia. And my topic is about actually the interconnection of anti-corruption efforts in Armenia and gender equality in terms of social inclusion, and what an intersectional approach towards these issues could have, or what role they could play. It's important to note that this paper is not finished. It's actually still at a starting point. So I will share the stuff that we know about the themes, current stances, one of the theories, and at the end, I would be very thankful if people who are interested can share their views in what direction to go. So corruption is a threat to a nation's rule of law, democracy, human rights, and it undermines good governance, fairness, and social justice. This hinders economic development, a fair market economy, and endangers stability of a democracy. To look in a theoretical perspective towards these issues, I've used the structural violence theory from Galtung, and basically within the structural violence theory, Galtung recognizes the interconnectedness between corruption and gender equality. So, for example, social institutions, social structures, and systems influence the corruption roots, and they are deeply rooted actually in societal structures and systems, and therefore corruption flourishes in societies, mostly where unequal power distributions are dominant. In addition, gender equality and social inclusion can contribute to these existing power relations and distributions that are imbalanced, and therefore it shapes the shapes of whom it affected most is by corruption is taking place within those systems. The interconnected dynamics are mostly interconnected and mutually reinforcing each other. Gender discrimination, for example, or and inequality and exclusion increase vulnerability towards corruption for marginalized groups mostly. Resources, opportunities, and decision-making processes are in limited access towards these groups. So addressing corruption without actually underlying factors such as gender equality and social exclusion have no effect in tackling these corruption through anti-corruption efforts. So the theory of structural violence underscores the impact that anti-corruption efforts, corruption have on individuals and communities are very wide-ranging. Inequality and exclusion, they can limit anti-corruption efforts, mostly by limiting participation of these groups, transparency for them, and mostly like accountability institutions. So even Galtung is implying that transformative solutions are needed. You have to go beyond surface level interventions so you can tackle and have a clear, sensitive approach towards these factors. The current stances, especially around 2002, the EU and other Western donors had a specific focus on anti-corruption in the South Caucasus. By then, they were actually amongst the top corrupt countries in the whole region. Although Georgia made some improvements, Azerbaijan and Armenia were still lacking in anti-corruption efforts. Some of these obstacles were good governance, economic growth, that the corruption has for these countries, a competitive market economy, socioeconomic development, democratic levels, but that also hindered foreign investments. Although since 2018, as you can see, this is taken from the Transparency International, who conducted Corruption Perception Index. You can see that actually Armenia did make a lot of improvements since 2018. At some point, they became one of the most improved countries in definitely in the region and even amongst the world with the rise that they had. But as you also can see, since then, mostly since 2020, it has stagnated a little bit. When we look at the gender profile of Armenia, that is conducted by this, I didn't mention here, but this comes mostly from the EU for Gender Equality research about Armenia's gender profile. You can see that also on gender equality, there have been improvements made, both legally and in policy terms. For example, laws to protect women's rights and combat gender-based violence. But there is still, although some improvements, a big gap in political representation amongst women. They are very underrepresented and higher positions are lessly filled by women. Economic empowerment, there's actually quite a big number of women working in Armenia, being labored. However, the opportunities they get to grow, the equal wages, and the possibility to get higher positions are still big barriers. Gender-based violence is still a very big issue in Armenia, unfortunately. Although the improvements there is and awareness, there are still about 1/4 of women who experience gender-based violence. But mostly cultural and social norms also play a role in hindering gender equality in Armenia because traditional gender roles are still very dominant. So there has been a public perceptions research on corruption in Armenia and behaviors has been done. This research report is not published. So I could only take some results from the document, although I would have liked, and I'm still trying to get access to the data to perform my own analysis and look at the answers of the questions, but then focus on, for example, gender differences and socioeconomic differences. Well, a big part of the population in Armenia believes that corruption cannot or only partially be reduced. What is mostly interesting is that young people, women, and higher educated people from Yerevan mostly believe that corruption to them has a rather big or very big impact in their environment and communities. Again, this is one of the only few differences in answers of the questions that I got that was written in the report, but not done by my own analysis, which hopefully I would be able to get into very soon. Then there has been a research done by CRRC. 4 different focus group discussions have been done with, as you can see, the local authorities of Yerevan, CSO representatives, regional authorities, and private sector companies. And they basically discussed about corruption efforts, and its relation with, for example, gender and gender equality. And the answers through these focus group discussions are pretty interesting because they also differ in what these different groups think about whether there is or isn't a connection. As you, for example, can see, the Yerevan local authorities, which I have to mention, it consisted of a group of 9 female authorities focus group discussion, and they were actually mostly hesitant about that there is whether a correlation or a big impact of corruption and social groups such as female. With a note to say that also Yerevan local authorities compared to, for example, the regional authorities have a bigger social distancing with different social groups in their community. So they're also less aware of what is actually going on within Yerevan, while regional authorities are way closer towards the people in their regions and therefore have a better view or idea of what problems are going on within their community. Maybe not so surprising, CSO representatives clearly mentioned a lot about the intersectionality between anti-corruption and the impact it has on different social groups. And in comparison with business authorities, they had actually not a big queue in general. There are different questions, as you can see. We're not going through all of them. Sometimes there is a blank space. That means that question was apparently not asked for that group. So there have been notable efforts made by Armenia in terms of combating corruption, mostly through institutional reforms, engagement with international initiatives, and the engagement of civil society. Continued efforts are still needed to address systematic challenges that are associated with corruption and to achieve sustained progress in the fight against corruption. Still, like in any country that is combating corruption, there's a lot of challenges that are still remaining, mostly like political will, institutional effectiveness, transparency, and accountability, but also social cultural factors and cooperation with international partners in the arena, commitment, cooperating with stakeholders are still a big focus plan. There are a lot of action plans that are recommended to Armenia for the coming years, such as the EU action plans or recommendations by the OECD. Anti-corruption and human rights are big pillars of what they should do to progress in those areas. However, which was very interesting to me, is that I could not, in none of these action plans, I could find the actual, the intersectional approach to see or clearly state what corruption, what layers of corruption for different social groups there are in Armenia and how they can be tackled. So even in these action plans, a gender-sensitive approach is still lacking, although both the OECD and EU, as well as ministries of Armenia, have mentioned before that they are taking problems like gender equality very serious, and they should look into their policy reforms and reviews more in a gender-sensitive way. I could not really find that back yet in the plans for the following years. So, having said all this, I would be very curious about your opinion. What do you think about the importance of this topic? Is it researched enough, or do you think there has to be more research about the interconnection? And if so, which directions would you suggest I could go or partners of us could go? And what type of follow-up study would you guys recommend? Yeah, I don't want to, without your permission, open the Q&A session already, but this was just mostly my presentation, and I would like to hear your feedback.
Thank you very much again to all the presenters. These were definitely very interesting presentations on very pressing issues for the region at the moment. So I'm sure there's a lot of questions in the audience. But since we have only a few minutes left for Q&A session, I want to ask you to please keep your questions as brief as possible. So let's collect the questions for all the presenters. And then we will collect several questions and let the presenters answer them. Maybe there's also questions online. You can let us know or write on chat. We are following that. We also unfortunately have only 2 microphones, so I will ask for your help to help me pass around the microphone if anyone has questions. So, floor is yours.
Yes, I will. No, wait. Okay, got it. All right. As the European of the room, I'll ask a question related to EU involvement. How do you see the drive? Is it more from member states or the EU institutions? If that's in the realm of your paper, and I'd be interested specifically if you have. I'm curious, being French, the role of France. I know it's quite common in French political discourse.
Clear questions, like very clear from you. You mean the role of the EU?
Is it more for coming from EU institutions or the member states? You think this role in the region? Okay. To keep it short.
Yeah, actually, now I'm thinking still, since we have this uncomfortable situation with microphone, maybe it's
Since
better.
Here, so I will answer. Okay. My. So I think both. Why? Because usually the position. I mean, in the EU institutions, in terms of Azerbaijan, like not especially for the conflict, but the situation regarding human rights democratization process, usually the position of the commission and the parliament are not the same. The parliament are always very the position that criticizing a lot, but the commission is more in the cooperation mode. So that's why I think not directly but indirectly we can see the reflection of this attitude from the parliament also in the case of the conflict itself. So that's why I cannot truly say that all the EU institutions has the same position on the same issue that in case of Armenia and Azerbaijan. So yeah, it's different for EU. And also for member states. I think in the content of Azerbaijan, even it's common sense in Azerbaijan that the co-chairs of the OCC Minsk group, the France is not actually a very reliable partner. I mean, the co-chair in terms of being a part of this group, because the several bias approach by the President Macron in this process, I mean, it always faced the very rush, let's say, harshly, response from the Azerbaijani officials regarding the positions of the France in this process. And if we just see the France is one of the let's say the one of the co-chair of this group, and like playing a very important role in terms of peace talks in the region. So that's why I cannot also say that for all the EU member states. And also we can see here like the other member states. I mean, they have like more or less they have a different positions on this regard. So actually this is one of the opportunity for the European Commission itself to take this role to being playing the important role in the peace talks for Azerbaijan and Armenia. Yeah, that's fine.
Thank you. We actually have a question from online audience to Irina. Irina, you explained that Russia's strategy of misinformation was one meant to create confusion. Would you also say their intent is to cause pessimism and nihilism among Georgians for the country's economic and political future?
Should I answer it?
Yes,
right away?
please.
Yeah,
Let's go
sure.
this way.
Thank you very much for the question. Definitely, Russia intends to spread confusion over what is happening, and it intends to erode trust fraying of the fabric of society due to polarization, and the result of this condition are cynicism or active polarization. And of course, nihilism and pessimism is very important for them, because it's actually when you're when you are like nihilist and towards the situation, you are not motivated to change anything. You think that there is no point to do something. So that's what actually Russia tries to do. So that was my point exactly. And yeah, it doesn't, as I said, it doesn't try to present lies as truth, but to confuse people, exactly to make them nihilist. Thank you.
Thank you, Irina, very much. Any other questions?
Sure, if this is gonna work. Can try this one.
Okay, thank you. So I have a couple questions for different papers. The first for the mis and disinformation paper. It seemed like there was a spectrum from demonstrably untrue to sort of inconveniently true-ish statements. And as you said, some of this is not efforts necessarily to like broadly lie, but to confuse. And I was just wondering if there's more of a typology that exists, and then in particular, what types of groups, because you called it at some point, I think, epistemic confusion, if I had the term right. But when I think of in other areas of research where there's mis and disinformation in the area of like climate change, there's this effort to bring epistemic communities to the forefront to try to combat this. So I'm curious about what are the epistemic communities that could potentially combat some of these mistruths. And then secondly, for the paper on the Southern Military District. So in a related to this first paper, I was thinking about some Facebook posts I'd seen from some friends who are analysts talking about this South Ossetian unit in a part of Ukraine. I don't speak Russian or Ukrainian, so I can't pronounce it, but that it looks like they have been completely decimated, right? They showed some video of probably 100 people, and then they said, no, they had not been defeated. And then they had a video of 10 people. So clearly something had gone in between. And I was wondering though, what are the incentives to lie about these things as well? So you were talking about how you were trying to separate the lies from the truth, but actually the lies themselves in this area might also be interesting. And so thinking a little bit systematically about where people are lying about it. And finally, the last paper, the intersectionality and gender on corruption. I just thought a little bit about the general question of like the palatability in the broader context of the previous panel and some issues on this panel as well. Anti-corruption efforts from the West being pushed at the same time as issues related to gender being brought in. I can clearly see why it's important for both a normative and positive stance. But I do wonder how bringing gender intersectionality, if you've thought a little bit about how this might affect efforts to make reforms as well. So thinking carefully about like bringing gender into the conversation in a way that will cause the types of things you would argue for to be no longer palatable. So how you can sell researching in this area or pushing issues in this area in a way that makes it seem as though it's valuable to those who might see bringing gender into the area as a potential liability or susceptible to introduction of misinformation, et cetera, linking this to other sort of quote unquote European style values as compared to maybe more traditional values. So thanks.
Thank you very much for questions. I think first one was for Irina. Irina?
Yeah, right. Thank you very much for the very important question and very interesting. The term itself was epistemic anarchy, like the anarchy, which means that there is no like super force, like authority out there, right? So that's why it makes confusion. So there is nobody to direct you what to do and how to solve the problem. But the thing is that I genuinely think that promoting media literacy is very important here, like educating individuals on how to critically evaluate information sources, and also strengthening fact-checking organizations, support and promote independent fact-checking organizations that verify the accuracy of news and information, and also probably encourage responsible journalism, let's say, like promote ethical reporting practices among journalists. And again, like if Georgian government has the strategy how to counter this disinformation, they should definitely include this confusion component there and think of the strategies how to tackle it. So yeah, that would be that is a hard question because I couldn't say like direct answer on that, but yeah, that's my opinion.
Thank you, Irina. I believe next question was to Justin. Please, Justin, if you could.
Yes, hi, thank you. I really appreciate that question. I'll try to keep this short because I know we're short on time. There's two ways to look at that question. The first is the, I guess, sub part of that. What is the incentive to lie, or why would a party in a conflict, like lie and misrepresent things? Beyond the immediate sense of saving face and just obscuring the sake of, your own position in a conflict, I think there is something to be said about times when, even with good intent, numbers are conflated. And by that, I mean, you could read a report where it says Russian or Ukrainian brigade sustains heavy losses in a territory. And when we read that, we can read that as heavy losses, as in a lot of fatalities. But the numbers, when you read, let's say, losses amounting to 800, could be 100 fatalities, 200 people wounded, another 100 people captured, and then the rest of the formation broken and scattered. In a lot of cases, what we see with Eastern Ukraine is that it's not so much that entire units are completely destroyed and wiped off the face of the earth, as much as they are routed. So whatever positions they held, whatever command structure they held, has just dissolved, and it's people fleeing. And even if everyone in that unit is still technically capable of fighting, they are so disorganized and scattered that there's no sense in that being considered a unit anymore. There was a period of time last summer where the Russian MOD would only report numbers of Ukrainian losses in multiples of like 260. And it could be that there was that much of a fatality and wounding occurring. But what's more realistic is that the Russian military was counting Ukrainian losses also in terms of divisions and units that had been scattered or whose command chain had been broken. To what degree is that divide intentional obscuring versus unintentional conflating? I'm not quite sure. But in the case of this, let's say, Ossetian group, I feel like I know the one that you mentioned. It was like earlier this month, but yeah, it was like 200 people that supposedly been wiped out. Or more specifically, it was the comparison photo of them at their muster point with all of the individuals and their armored vehicles, etc. And then them today, where there's like a dozen of them. Could it be that they've sustained insanely high fatalities? Maybe. I feel like also if you have 300 people or 400 people perish on the battlefield, word of that travels really quick. What's more likely is that that large force, one, could be geographically scattered in multiple areas where you can't have this many people line up for a photo. It also could be that there are people who are KIA, WIA, people who are burnt out from fighting and shifted out, or they get broken up and incorporated into different Russian units. A lot of ambiguity. There's no easy answer to it. But again, the history of this is being written right now, and I'm sure a year from now we can know exactly what happened today. But right now it's just a little bit difficult to get through that opacity.
Thank you very much. And last, Melik, please. We're actually sacrificing the time for the break to the Q&A session, but yeah, maybe we can add one more question if we have time.
If I understand your question well, basically you're asking how I could sell the importance of doing research about the interconnectedness of anti-corruption efforts and gender equality in Armenia. To whom, you mean?
I mean, I guess not necessarily sell it, but to make sure that this important work is not vilified by groups that might like see this as a effort to bring these concepts of intersectionality, right, to become sort of a dirty word in some circles. So like, how do you prove that this is like valid against that, or maybe we just don't care? That's the thing. That's stuff goes on.
Yeah. Well, I think that if you look at these statements of the current government of the Armenian state, anti-corruption efforts and improving human rights are definitely raised as a big focus point. The support of the society at this moment might not be that high. If you look, for example, at the Caucasus barometer statistics, corruption, for example, or human rights were not mentioned at all as the first or second most important issue of the country. Still, I think it's very important to look at these things because there are several CSO NGO organizations that focus a lot on both anti-corruption in the Armenian state in terms of providing better opportunities in economic progress and stuff, as well as, for example, gender inequalities that still limit a lot of marginalized groups and people in Armenia to fully participate in a fair way and get the opportunity and be supported to do that. I guess there are definitely points where we could hopefully like climb in and advocate for the importance. Intersectionality itself is maybe not a most common concept in the Armenian society yet. That doesn't mean it's not important to look at the intersections actually of being a female in Armenia and how that could limit you in several things. And the same counts for other social groups. Yeah, I don't know if it's like an answer to your question specifically, but
we can talk later. I mean,
yeah.
Yes, since there is one more question, please, let's try to keep it very, very brief. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope you hear me. The question is for Mehraj. I just want to know whether Mehraj, I'm sorry, Mehraj. Yes, I just want to know whether you had the opportunity to study how the European Union's how European Union will balance the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, whether you saw, because for a couple of decades, we knew that it is either Russia or OSCE Minsk group that mediated the conflict, and how it is going to balance the situation, and what are the further steps for Russia, because as you said, currently it is the European Union who took the lead and is conducting the mediations in Brussels. Thanks.
Thank you for your question.
Can you pass it a bit?
I will. Thank you so much for your question. I think that firstly the role of the Russia in the region still is dominant, one of the powerful actor in the region, and we cannot deny this fact. Because they are in the field, they have their peacekeepers in the field, they are keeping the peace in the region. So if you are asking my like personal perception in this, my study in terms of the EU, I think based on my study, I just say that like the comparatively to the last 30. 3 decades, the role of the what I see at the end of the study, still it's ongoing. The role of the European Union in the region is going increase day by day, because especially in the case of the new agreement that's signed between Azerbaijan and EU. I'm talking especially in the case of Azerbaijan. But all these efforts that EU trying to push towards, and also recent European political community meetings that happened in Moldova and province in Prague, and both like Prime Minister Pashinyan, Aliyev was there in terms of like through the invitation of the Charles Michel, and all those efforts that leading by the European Union just like clearly shows up that the interest of the EU in the region for the peaceful resolution of the conflict is part of their interest. And this is what I see at the end of the study. I mean, through the researching this this topic. Yeah, I think. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. It took away our break, but I think it was very much worth it. And actually, already in 3 minutes, the conference will continue with the roundtable discussion on archival access and openness in the Caucasus and Eurasia. I hope you'll be participating. Thank you very much once again.